At sunrise on the quiet streets of Burkina Faso, ordinary citizens began their day as they always do, women sweeping the front of their homes, elders greeting neighbors, small shops opening their wooden shutters. Nothing seemed unusual. But just a few blocks away, a different scene was unfolding, one that left many people standing still watching in silence. A group of men and women long known on these streets for pretending to be blind, limping on one leg, or sitting beside small children to beg for money, were suddenly being asked to stand up and tell the truth. And they did stand up. For the first time, the public saw something they were never meant to see: people who appeared fragile and helpless only moments earlier now walking with full strength. Their canes, their bandages, even their feigned weakness, none of it could hide the reality any longer. The newly formed civic force known as Brigad Labal was there to confront a problem that had quietly shaped daily life for years: healthy adults choosing begging over honest work, and in some cases using children to do it. For many older Americans watching today, this moment may feel strangely familiar. It echoes the years when communities believed deeply in responsibility, dignity, and the idea that every person who could work should contribute to the society that protects them. But it also raises a moral question we cannot ignore. What happens to a nation when the lines between genuine hardship and intentional manipulation are blurred, and who has the right to redraw those lines? Burkina Faso has chosen to answer that question boldly, and the world is beginning to take notice. If you want to understand not just what happened, but why it happened and what it reveals about the new leadership rising across Africa, stay with us. And if you believe that truth matters more than headlines, please subscribe to support voices that bring you stories mainstream media will never explain. Long before the cameras arrived, the people of Burkina Faso had grown used to a familiar sight: men and women sitting along busy intersections with tattered clothes, bowed heads and hands stretched out to passing travelers. Some carried infants wrapped in cloth, others leaned heavily on wooden sticks, a few dragged their legs or covered their eyes as though blind. To the average passerby, they appeared to be among the most vulnerable members of society. But on this particular morning, something shifted. A quiet but determined civic force, Brigad Labal, created in June 2025 to restore order, hygiene, and public discipline, approached these groups with a different kind of compassion, one rooted not in pity, but in responsibility. Their mandate was simple: enforce the law, protect public space, and preserve human dignity by ensuring that no able-bodied adult made a living by exploiting sympathy. The officers began by asking gentle but firm questions. Do you have work? Have you applied for any jobs? Why are these children with you on the street? For many of those confronted, the questions alone seemed disarming. Some tried to maintain their act, limping, bending their backs, pretending not to hear. But when asked to stand, they stood with ease. When asked to walk, they walked without hesitation. The facade collapsed in seconds. More startling discoveries followed. Inside their oversized clothing were deep pockets stuffed with money amounts that many hardworking citizens could not earn in a full week. In several bags, officers found small knives used not for defense against attackers, but to protect their earnings from other beggars. This was not helplessness. This was a system, a profitable one, built on deception. But the most troubling detail involved the children. Some adults brought toddlers as emotional leverage, placing them on sidewalks for hours under the harsh sun. Under Burkina Faso's law, this is not only unethical, it is a punishable offense. And so Brigad Labal did what is required by statute. They explained every law that had been broken. Article after article was read aloud. Begging while able-bodied is illegal, punishable by up to 6 months in prison. Pretending to be blind, injured, or disabled even without resources is punishable by up to 1 year. Using children under 6 years old to solicit money in public spaces carries fines and potential imprisonment. Forcing or manipulating disabled persons to beg carries maximum penalties. Parents who expose their children to delinquency or exploit them for begging may lose custody entirely. The point was not humiliation. The point was clarity. Every individual, whether from Burkina Faso or another country, was told precisely what the law demanded. Only after the legal explanations were complete did Brigad Labal make its decision. The group would not be taken to prison, although the law allowed it. Instead, they were placed into what the government calls corrective civic labor. It is a system that allows offenders to repay fines through structured work that benefits the public: cleaning streets, clearing drains, rehabilitating parks, and supporting ongoing community projects. When the van doors closed and the engine started, many bystanders watched in silence. A few nodded with approval, others seemed unsure how to feel. But everyone understood one thing clearly: the country was drawing a line. Burkina Faso was declaring that work mattered, dignity mattered, and citizens, whether native-born or migrants, could not build a life on deception. Hours later, the same individuals who once claimed to be blind or crippled were seen wearing work vests, holding tools, and contributing to the very society they once misled. And for many who witnessed this transformation, it became a defining moment, a moment when a nation decided that compassion and accountability could walk together. The true moment of revelation came not during the confrontation on the street, and not even when Brigad Labal loaded the violators into their vans. The real climax unfolded hours later under the blazing West African sun on a stretch of land where public works were underway. It was here, far from the crowded sidewalks and the pity of passers-by, that the truth became undeniable. One by one, those who only that morning had dragged their feet or leaned heavily on canes now stepped out of the van with steady legs and clear, confident movements. The same individuals who had pretended to wobble, shake, or stumble now picked up shovels, lifted paving stones, and bent to clean roadside gutters without hesitation. Their bodies, once portrayed as frail or broken, revealed their actual strength in plain sight. For many citizens who gathered around the worksite, this moment triggered a shock that rippled through the air. Some covered their mouths in disbelief. Others exchanged glances of frustration at years of misplaced compassion, at the manipulation of charitable hearts, and at seeing children dragged into a life that was never theirs to carry. And for the elderly onlookers, those who had lived through harder decades of Burkina Faso's past, this moment carried an even deeper emotional weight: the realization that their nation had allowed deception to become a livelihood for too long. Yet this was not a spectacle meant to shame. It was a confrontation with reality. Residents found themselves asking a question they had avoided for years. How do we build a disciplined, dignified society if those capable of contributing actively choose not to? As whispers traveled through neighborhoods, reactions varied widely. Many Burkinabe expressed relief that the streets might finally be safer, cleaner, and free from the aggressive tactics of beggars who were often stronger than the elderly they targeted. Parents celebrated the idea that children could no longer be displayed as props or taught early in life that deception was a viable path. But there were also voices of concern. A few citizens wondered whether everyone apprehended truly had alternatives. Could it be that some were simply lost between poverty and opportunity? Was the system prepared to distinguish between genuine hardship and exploitation? The government's answer through Brigad Labal was clear: compassion must be paired with accountability. The civic labor program, unlike imprisonment, offered a way forward: work, dignity, and participation in building the nation. Long before any international outlet commented, the narrator of the original video issued a warning that echoed through the conversation: BBC and CNN will come and publish this the way they want, damaging the image of this man. To many Africans, this prediction felt familiar. They had watched international media frame similar events through a narrow lens, reporting on punishment without context, on enforcement without the decades of societal strain leading up to it. And so people braced for headlines such as "Government cracks down on poor citizens," "Forced labor for beggars raises human rights concerns." Yet those same headlines, if they appeared, would fail to mention the knives found in pockets, the fabricated disabilities, or the toddlers left on sweltering streets for profit. They would not show the interviews where individuals admitted that they simply did not want to work in agriculture or construction despite their full physical capacity. What made this moment so powerful was not the enforcement of law itself, but the moral clarity it forced upon everyone watching. Older citizens, both in Burkina Faso and abroad, recognized something they had long understood: societies collapse not only when the vulnerable are abandoned, but also when those who are capable refuse to contribute. And so, as the workers continued their tasks, cleaning drainage lines, clearing debris, reinforcing walkways, a new understanding settled across the public. This was not merely a crackdown, it was a national reset, a declaration that dignity was tied to responsibility, and that Burkina Faso would no longer allow its public spaces, its children, or its compassion to be exploited. The aftermath of the Brigad Labal operation did not end at the worksite. In fact, its deeper significance began only after the shovels were lifted and the streets were cleared. What unfolded next were the quiet but profound consequences, both civil and political, that would ripple across Burkina Faso. Within days, residents began noticing subtle changes. The congested intersections where beggars once clustered were suddenly clear. Parents no longer saw small children tugging at strangers' clothes or weaving dangerously through traffic. The sense of unease, of not knowing whether a beggar was truly in need or simply waiting for an opportunity, began to fade. For elderly citizens, these changes brought a renewed feeling of safety. Many remembered times decades earlier when discipline and public order were not considered oppressive but essential to communal life. Watching sidewalks return to their intended purpose reminded them that a city's health begins with its public spaces. But the civil consequences went further. People now witnessed a government insisting that no one is disposable and that poverty should not be weaponized as a tool of manipulation. What emerged was a new social expectation. If you are able-bodied, you are expected to contribute, not through punishment, but through structured work that restores both dignity and order. This expectation had a psychological effect as well. Those who genuinely struggled, people with legitimate disabilities, single mothers without support, elders without pensions, found themselves seen more clearly. Without the noise of deception around them, their needs could finally be addressed with proper compassion. One of the most impactful outcomes was the protection of children. For years, the image of toddlers sitting beside adults on hot sidewalks had become normalized, but the operation exposed how deeply wrong that normalization was. After Brigad Labal intervened, children were no longer present in those spaces. Social workers could identify which families actually needed help versus which ones exploited minors for income. In a country rebuilding itself, safeguarding the next generation became an unspoken but critical priority. Politically, the operation became a defining moment for Burkina Faso's leadership. A government that dared to enforce long-ignored laws signaled something rare in modern politics: the will to confront uncomfortable truths head-on. International observers, especially within Africa, began to view Burkina Faso as a nation willing to choose sovereignty over sympathy-driven optics. Enforcing discipline on the streets may not win applause from every global institution, but it demonstrated a consistency that many African citizens longed for: leaders who protect the public good without fear of Western criticism. Domestically, the operation strengthened trust among everyday citizens. They saw a government that did not merely pass laws but applied them, even when doing so risked misunderstandings abroad. It reinforced the idea that authority exists not to intimidate, but to serve and protect. Finally, the civic labor program itself set a precedent. It did not criminalize poverty. It criminalized the refusal to participate in the nation's reconstruction. Through this lens, work became both a duty and an opportunity. Individuals who once survived through manipulation were now part of public projects that built roads, cleared waterways, and improved sanitation. This shift away from passive survival and toward active contribution began to redefine the social contract in Burkina Faso. And in the long run, it may prove to be one of the most transformative outcomes of all. From the vantage point of the United States, the events in Burkina Faso present a complex picture, one that challenges long-held assumptions about governance responsibility and the nature of poverty itself. For many older Americans who lived through eras defined by strong civic duty, community service, and clear social expectations, the decisive actions of Brigad Labal evoke memories of a time when contributing to one's neighborhood was not merely encouraged, but expected. Yet for others, especially those who have watched global media narratives for decades, the operation raises serious questions. Would U.S. news outlets portray it as an anti-poverty initiative grounded in law, or would they frame it as a crackdown on society's most vulnerable? The narrator of the original video anticipated this tension perfectly. Western headlines often highlight enforcement without acknowledging the years of systemic exploitation that made such enforcement necessary. From Washington to New York, policy observers would likely ask, where is the line between protecting public order and violating personal freedom? It is a debate the United States knows well. America has long wrestled with homelessness, addiction, and civic disorder issues that strain the balance between compassion and accountability. Seeing Burkina Faso take a firm, structured approach forces American audiences to confront a difficult question: is discipline inherently oppressive, or is it sometimes the only way to rebuild a society that has suffered too long from instability and neglect? Globally, the reaction is equally layered. Many African nations recognize the deeper meaning behind Burkina Faso's decision. It is not merely about beggars or street order. It is about reclaiming sovereignty over internal social problems before external institutions step in, with their own narratives or prescriptions. In a world where Western organizations often define what human rights should look like, Burkina Faso has chosen to define dignity through responsibility rather than dependency. European audiences, particularly in France and Belgium, may view the situation through the lens of post-colonial politics. Critics might argue that forced civic labor resembles coercion, but supporters would counter that Western governments themselves throughout the 20th century used public works programs such as the WPA during the Great Depression to lift citizens out of both poverty and passivity. Within the broader international community, Burkina Faso's operation signals a rising trend across Africa, leaders choosing culturally rooted, locally designed solutions rather than importing external models that do not address the continent's realities. And whether one likes or dislikes the method, there is a growing recognition that African societies are tired of being told what their values should be. This brings us to a final and delicate point: the moral lens through which Americans interpret global stories. Many older Americans understand deeply that dignity comes not just from receiving help, but from the act of contributing. Watching a nation insist on this principle challenges modern assumptions about rights without responsibilities. It also raises a genuine question about leadership, particularly figures like President Ibrahim Traore, whose approach has attracted both admiration and criticism. Is this the beginning of a new model of African governance, one that blends discipline, self-reliance, and national pride? And more importantly, what does this say about the future of Africa, news, global perception, and the long-term relationship between African sovereignty and Western media? As the dust settled on the streets of Burkina Faso and the sound of tools scraping pavement faded into the afternoon, the nation found itself at a crossroads. What had begun as a simple enforcement operation revealed a deeper truth: societies succeed or fail not by the strength of their laws alone, but by the spirit with which their people choose to live together. And in this case, the spirit rising from the ground was one of renewal, measured not by speeches or slogans, but by the quiet discipline of ordinary men and women finally putting their strength to work. Yet even as progress takes shape, a quiet warning lingers in the air. Any system that wields authority must always guard against the temptation to overreach. The same tools that restore dignity can, in the wrong hands, take it away. Burkina Faso's challenge in the months ahead will be to preserve the careful balance between compassion and accountability, ensuring that its civic reforms uplift the nation without silencing those who are genuinely vulnerable. True strength, after all, lies not in the firmness of enforcement, but in the fairness of its application. Still, this moment opens a window into something larger, a shift that is starting to ripple across the African continent. When people see able-bodied adults contributing through public labor instead of burdening children or exploiting sympathy, faith in community begins to return. And when a government shows that discipline can be married with opportunity, a new social contract begins to form. This is the story the world rarely hears about Africa, and yet it may be one of the most important chapters of its future. For older Americans watching from afar, there is something strangely familiar in this transformation. It echoes a time when neighborhoods took responsibility for their own order, when work was seen not as punishment, but as purpose, when nation building began with the dignity of each individual. And it raises a question worth pondering. If discipline can rebuild trust in a nation emerging from instability, what might it rebuild in societies far wealthier but equally fractured? As Burkina Faso continues under a leadership determined to redefine sovereignty, leaders like Ibrahim Traore, who insist that dignity must be earned, not inherited, the world will be forced to reconsider what true progress looks like. Perhaps the real story here is not about beggars or enforcement, but about a continent challenging the assumptions of the global narrative. So as you reflect on what you've heard today, I invite you to consider a simple question. Do you believe that any nation can rise without asking every capable citizen to rise with it? If today's story gave you a clearer picture of what is truly happening in Burkina Faso, please share it. And if you believe that the truth behind Africa news matters more than the headlines, subscribe and stay with us. Your voice helps ensure that stories shaping the future of nations, stories like this one, are not lost in the noise.